Okay, I think we'll get started now. Welcome once again to everyone. I'm delighted to introduce today's distinguished speaker, Professor Ravi Kanbur. Professor Kanbur conducts research and teaches in development economics, public economics, and economic theory in the Dyson School. He's well known globally for his role in policy analysis and engagement in international development. He's served in a wide variety of roles, including the Chief Economist for Africa at the World Bank. He's widely published in the world's leading economics journals. Currently, he's president of the Human Development and Capabilities Association.
Identify.
Chairs the board of the UN University World Institute for Development Economics Research, co-chair of the Scientific Council, the International Panel on Social Progress, and on and on. So it's a very long list. So take a look at his website, and you can get a better sense of the many ways that he's engaged globally in economic policy. And Professor Kanbur comes to us today with an important topic and an intriguing title: An Age of Rising Inequality. No, but yes. Thanks for joining us today, Ravi.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Terry, and thank you for the invitation. Let me share my screen and we can get started. I'll speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have questions and discussion after that. Okay. So is that working?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. Thanks. Good. So, well, we're all familiar with the narrative, rising inequality, an age of rising inequality, and so on and so forth. So this takes a closer look at that. Of course, it does so through a particular lens, through a particular set of issues that I want to raise. There are many other ways of looking at this, and no doubt those will come up in the discussion. So let's get started, and here's the outline. I'm going to just very briefly talk about measuring inequality, then the age of rising inequality, and then the no part and the but yes part, and then a conclusion. So, whenever you talk about inequality, one has to say a few words on concepts, on data and measurement and so on. And I won't say very much on it, but we can discuss it. You always have to ask the question: inequality of what, and inequality between whom? And, I think somebody needs to mute. What economic? The question is, what are the economic? Inequality of what? And then, of course, my focus will be on economic magnitudes, inequality of economic magnitudes like income or consumption. We can discuss other aspects, and I've spent my life emphasizing other aspects. But this particular focus is on economic magnitudes, inequality of economic magnitudes like income or consumption. And there are a host of technical discussions here, technical issues here about how you do price corrections between rural areas, urban areas, and all of that sort of stuff. There are big debates in this thing, which I'm not going to be able to address. Then inequality between whom is the second type of question that you really have to clarify right at the start. And the typical practice in national statistical measures and so on is to focus on differences in these economic magnitudes, income or consumption, let's say, across individuals. So when you see the measures of inequality and poverty and so on, they're all individual-based measures. And again, there are a whole host of technical issues. How do you address what differing needs across individuals and so on? And there are big debates on this. Intra-household inequality and so on. And I and many others have written all of these things. But again, that's not going to be my main focus. And then given the what and the whom, the next question is, how do you characterize, how do you measure the spread or inequality of a distribution, or the inequality of whatever it is you want to measure, and the inequality between whomever you want to measure? Well, again, there are many measures: the Gini coefficient, the mean log deviation, the share of the top percent, the share of the bottom, and so on. And then there's a 90-10 ratio, et cetera, et cetera. And again, there are big debates about what each type of measure hides, what each type of measure highlights, and so on. And again, that's not my focus in this talk. And the point is that there are these debates, and all of these debates have to be resolved in some form or fashion by national statistical offices and international organizations when they produce the numbers on inequality and poverty that we all of us use. And by the way, I've noticed that people are far less critical of these statistics when they support the argument they're making than when they go against the argument they're making. Okay, when if it goes against, then oh, there's this problem, there's that problem, and so on. But then we say, oh, did you know that inequality has gone up by this? And they use just the statistic that is without criticism, really. But anyway, my question is, given the way these are resolved and given the statistics that national statistical offices produce and international organizations produce, what do these numbers tell us about the global trends of in economic inequality? Well, you know, the rapid rises in standard measured inequality in the US, in parts of Europe, and in a range of big Asian countries like China and India, these have all been established. And this has led to this narrative: we're living in an age of rising inequality. And for the US and Europe, of course, the work of Thomas Piketty and his colleagues is well known. I don't know how many people know this, that in fact, Piketty's book, which is 800 pages with graphs and charts and equations, spent time in the New York Times bestseller list. And it beat out some Disney book on children's story book, okay? It just tells you the zeitgeist that a technical book on inequality could be top of the New York Times bestseller list. And that work is well known certainly amongst economists and a broader audience. For Asia, the work of the Asian Development Bank, for example, even a decade ago, presented data which showed that between the 1990s and the 2000s, the decade of the 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s, inequality had risen in countries comprising 80% or more of developing Asia's population. I was involved with that work more than a decade ago. And the most spectacular of the cases of increasing inequality is, of course, China. And after its opening up in 1978, and especially after the opening up to the world from the 1990s onwards, we all know China has had dramatic growth and actually unheard of poverty reduction. But it has also had very sharp increases in inequality. As work with the former Cornell PhD student, Xiaobo Zhang, and current PhD student, Yue Wang. Actually, when I say current, she passed her B exam a week ago, so congratulations to Yue. Our work shows that between 1995 and 2010, over that 15-year period, the Gini coefficient in China rose from 0.35 to 0.53. And those of you who know how slowly Gini coefficients change, how little they change across observations, who will know that that's a massive increase in a very short time. And all of this has fed into the narrative that we're living in an age of rising inequality. But you know, if by an age of rising inequality, we mean, we have to define what you mean by that, but if by that is meant that inequality is rising everywhere, or almost everywhere, empirically, that claim is actually not true. And this is what I want to talk about now. This is the first of my claims that no. And there are significant counter trends in inequality measured in the same way, the same sort of data as the data that we use to say that inequality is rising in the US, is rising in China, all that sort of stuff, okay? In other words, it's the same frame, the same whatever, there's nothing funny going on here, but there is the leading exhibit for a counter trend in the same type of inequality measures is Latin America, which once used to be the poster child for high and rising inequality. However, again, many of you will know that from about the mid-1990s onwards, measured inequality in most Latin American countries fell for the next 15 years. Okay, and this is I've given references, and there are references at the back of this PowerPoint which you can follow up on. So Latin America is the best known counter trend, the declining inequality in Latin America over a 15-year period, 15 to 20-year period. But you know, there are counters, not just in Latin America, but from elsewhere in the world as well. So Sub-Saharan Africa, I'm quoting from a report by Kathleen Beagle et al. For the subset of 23 countries for which survey data are available. Again, the same type of data that's available for the countries for which we say inequality is rising. Half the countries experience a decline in inequality. The other half experience an increase. No clear patterns are observed by countries, resources status, income status, or initial level of inequality. I'm just setting out the facts here, just the empirical facts. We may well ask, why is it that in some countries it's not, inequality is not rising, and we'll come to that. Here we go, Middle East and North Africa. Here's a report from Krishna et al. With the exception of Djibouti, the 90-10 ratio, which is the measure of inequality, for most MENA countries appears to hover between whatever and whatever. But the key thing is the ratio appears to have declined or stayed the same in all countries except Iraq. So here are the Arab Spring countries, where again, the narrative was that it was rising inequality that caused the Arab Spring. Actually, when you look at the data, there's been sort of roughly steady and no sort of sharp increase around that period. And again, that raises in my mind a lot of big questions about whether in fact, what type of inequality is the basis of political unrest. But just simply looking at the facts in the same way that we look at the facts for rising inequality in these other countries, actually, there's been a fair amount of stability in the Middle East. And finally, let me just mention China. Even for China, the picture is actually more nuanced than the common narrative. In fact, in the work that Jabot and I and Yue have done, we show that although there was this massive increase from 1995 up to 2010, the middle of the up to 2010 or whatever, from roughly speaking from 2010 onwards, the Gini coefficient, at least at the very least, we can say that the rate of increase of the Gini coefficient has slowed down. A stronger claim is that it has plateaued. An even stronger claim is that it has turned down a little bit. Okay. There are all data issues and so on and so forth. And by the way, this paper has just now been published in the Journal of Comparative Economics. But the old story that inequality is inexorably increasing, which was true and which work that Jabot and I did 20 years ago established, is actually no longer the case, at least not in as sharper form as it used to be. So here's a chart which might be of interest to you. On the horizontal axis is the Gini index in countries around 1990, and the vertical axis is the Gini index around 2015. If we were living in an age of rising inequality, all those dots would be above the 45-degree line. But actually, they're not. It's basically what I've been saying in my verbal narrative before. This is a very useful data source. It's called Our World in Data. Please look it up. It's a very useful data source for many different things, not just inequality. Now let me talk about a second sense to my first thing, which is no. Think of ranking everybody in the world. Think now world inequality as being inequality across everybody in the world. In real terms, correcting for prices, doing all those things, okay, from the richest to the poorest individual, and calculate the inequality on the world income distribution. And think of that world inequality as being composed of two parts: inequality within nations and inequality between nations. There's, of course, inequality within each nation. We've just been talking about that in China and India and so on and so forth. But there's also inequality between nations, inequality in the per capita income across nations. And in some senses, you can see intuitively that overall world inequality is composed of those two things. That inequality which is there because there are rich countries and poor countries, and that inequality which is there because even within every country, there is variation. Well, let's ask these questions. What has happened to these? What has happened to the world distribution of income? Actually, the world Gini coefficient, all individuals in the world, actually fell over a 20-year period from the late 80s to the 2000s. This is work of Lackner and Milanovic, and similar calculations for later data and so on by Revalian and Bourguignon and so on, all confirm this, again, using the same sort of data that we use for other things. And one way to think about this is what is happening. It's true that inequality within countries like the US, like China, like whatever, increased. But actually, when you think about it, inequality between countries decreased. Just think of a world composed of the US and China. China has been growing at 10% per year in real terms. The US economy has barely broken 2% per capita income. So there's been a closing up, very fast closing up. I mean, there's still a big gap, but the fast closing up between China and India. So the between country component has been going down. The within country component is nuanced, okay? It's going up in some countries, it's going down in some countries, as we just discussed. But the net effect is it's an empirical question as to what those two forces, how they come together. And the answer, the empirical answer, is that actually it's gone down. So this is the second sense in which I say no. And we can, each of these points that I'm making can be elaborated upon. We can discuss and debate in detail and so on and so forth. Okay. So the answer to the question, are we living in an age of rising inequality? Clearly is no, just empirically. If by this is meant inequality is rising everywhere or almost everywhere. There are big countries, there are significant countries, significant parts of the world where inequality has actually not been rising in the same way that it has been rising in the US, in India, in China. But actually, I've argued in my writings that the answer is not no, but yes. In the following sense, in the sense that the fundamental economic forces of technical change are aligned to increase inequality on a business as usual scenario. So the fundamental forces are making for rising inequality. The actual outcome is very mixed. And of course, the reason why it's mixed, the reason why there are differences in outcomes given the fundamental forces is because policies differ across different countries. And for example, the policies followed by Latin American countries, and we'll come to that. The point is, again, I don't need to tell you this, that we're living in an age where the trend of technical progress is to displace basic labor in favor of skilled labor and capital. Such labor-saving technical change, also called skill-biased technical change, has been the hallmark of the world economy for at least the last 3 decades, and it looks set to continue in the decades to come. There's a huge literature on this, which again I don't really need to emphasize to you, but there's technical literature which you can look up at the back of the PowerPoint. So for a period which could last for several decades, the displacement effect of these trends could work to increase inequality as wages of high-skilled labor increase and wages of basic labor fall. Well, actually, the wages of basic labor will fall if there's downward flexibility in those wages. But if there isn't downward flexibility in those wages, then unemployment will be created. So we have a situation in the US, which is characterized typically as a flexible labor market. The median real wage of unskilled labor has barely budged in the last 30 years. Youth unemployment in Spain, on the other hand, which is characterized as having downwardly inflexible wages, is in excess of 30%. So either because the wages will fall, or because if the wages don't fall, unemployment will be created. This massive structural change, this massive force of technical change, and it's not just my view, in those papers that I referenced earlier, is a major force pulling us towards greater inequality. And actually, in my view, in the policy context, we neglect these consequences of labor displacement, perhaps over decades to come, at our peril. And their manifestations are, of course, already present in the politics of Europe and of Europe. And where these trends have not as yet fully appeared, for example, in parts of Asia, although they're beginning to appear there, I mean, the whole issue of Chinese state-owned enterprises and the labor that's there, effectively displaced but being kept there for distributional reasons, is a story of its own. So where these trends have not as yet fully appeared, or whether they have been countered by policy, and I'm going to come to that, there is no room for complacency because the fundamental forces are in the direction of of rising inequality. And governments in Asia have already started worrying about this, and those in Latin America, in some sense, will have to keep running on policy to stand still on inequality because the underlying forces are to make for rising inequality. So this is one sense in which we are indeed living in an age of rising inequality. And of course, policy can address these to a greater or a lesser extent. And we can think about what we mean by policy addressing these things. And the standard thing is, since what the technological trend is doing is altering the relative demand for labor the relative demand for skilled labor versus unskilled labor, for educated labor versus basic labor, you can, of course, shovel on the supply side to counter or to balance out the demand side imbalance. You can create supply side of the skills and education, and of course, this is all discussed a lot in the literature. Or you can say, okay, let the market forces play out, and what we'll do is to redistribute after the event. Afterwards, we will redistribute the greater inequality in market income. Whichever of these, and you can do in combination these two things. And these policy responses are not problem-free, of course, and there are pros and cons and this and that and so on, and there's a big literature on that, and I've written and other people have written on this. But the point is that these policy instruments can be used to counter the forces for rising inequality. And what I've written is that given these fundamental forces, the reason why we find differing patterns of outcomes is that different countries have deployed these instruments to different extent and to different intensities. In fact, in the US and in the UK and so on, the instruments have actually gone in the other direction, where progressivity of tax systems has actually declined. So in fact, the rise in inequality has been exacerbated by the policy front. But in the Latin American context, essentially, again, we can go into the detail on this, but in fact, they work very well on the supply side of the labor market, on the skill side of the labor market, through their conditional cash transfers and so on. Okay, to keep children in school, to keep children in secondary education, etc. Plus, through policies like minimum wage, plus through policies like progressive redistribution, they managed to counter the underlying forces to such an extent that actually inequality fell in these same periods. And Latin America was facing, in some very broad senses, similar forces of technical change and so on. And yet, in the US and in other countries, they played out as an increasing inequality, and in Latin America, they were countered. But the fact remains that the underlying forces are of a particular type. But let me now highlight a second sense in which we are also living in an age of rising inequality. Perhaps the technical change thing, I think, is well understood and well appreciated. But perhaps what I'm now going to say is perhaps less well appreciated, although of course people talk about this as well. The point is the following, that unlike 50 years ago, unlike 60 years ago, in our globalized world of today, the global constraints on domestic policy towards mitigating inequality are greater. Okay? In this era of factor mobility, of capital mobility, the domestic constraints are greater. The point is the following, in order to do all these things, in order to do the things I mentioned about a supply side and redistribution, you need tax revenue, Okay? And the point is one of these forces, mobility of capital, means that corporate taxation, for example, to manage rising inequality directly or to raise revenue for expanding education and training, et cetera, is restricted in the absence of global agreements on minimum corporate tax rates. I see that this is something that Biden is now pushing, but this has been sorely lacking in the last 20, 25 years. And I don't need to tell you that in the absence of such agreements, there'll be a race to the bottom on these taxes. I need more revenue, so I put up my corporate tax rates, okay? But I have to, so I want to put up my corporate tax rate, but I have to worry that capital will then move to another country, which will actually undercut me. And in fact, the corporates are very well aware of this. The corporates a corporate sitting in Singapore goes to the Indonesian government and says, we'd really like to stay here, but the Malaysian government is offering us a good deal on tax breaks. And of course, they're saying the same thing to the Malaysian government. And Malaysia and Indonesia then get into a downward, a race to the bottom, a wasteful competition on their tax rates in the absence of a minimum tax agreement between them or more broadly. So here are some facts. It's not just some airy-fairy theory. Here are some facts on statutory corporate tax rates. And believe you me, whatever is true of statutory rates will be true of, so to speak, real rates. Whatever is true of de jure will probably be intensified de facto. These are statutory corporate tax rates over the last 15 years. Notice the trend? Okay. And this is exactly this downward race to the bottom in corporate taxation, in competition on corporate taxation. The same is true for mobility of skilled labor. Mobility of skilled labor also means that taxation of high incomes is constrained in the same way. and a policy race to the bottom then follows. Regulation and labor standards, another example. And I said Latin America had used minimum wages and so on to affect the distribution of income. Regulation and labor standards are a standard way of ensuring a fairer distribution of gains. But to the extent that international trade and investment agreements restrict the scope of independent regulatory policy, there is less leeway for national governments. But actually, without these agreements, there will be a race to the bottom as governments rush to put in lower standards. I lower my minimum wages, you lower your minimum wages, and so on, in the same way as I lower my corporate tax rates, you lower your corporate tax rates. And again, what is needed, just as the current argument for minimum corporate tax rates, are minimum standards agreements across countries exporting into common markets. Mobility of low-income, unskilled labor also raises issues for national management of inequality. If one country sets up transfer benefits at the low end in order to address this basic displacement of basic labor, for example, through universal basic income and so on, then clearly there'll be an inducement for labor to move into, for unskilled labor from another country to move into that. Okay? There are all sorts of restrictions and so on and so forth. I understand that, but the basic incentive will be there. Okay? And also, if one government offers generalized fiscal subsidies, such as food subsidies, to address inequality, that will also be an attraction for basic labor, which has been displaced elsewhere. So this leads to a bad competition not to do those things. Okay. There'll be a race to the bottom on transfer policy. I will not do as much as I would because I fear an influx of unskilled labor. I'm coming to the end of my presentation, and I've tried to leave sufficient time for discussion and so on. We're thus left with this conundrum that addressing national level inequality through national policy will be ineffective unless cross-national agreements can be reached on a range of tax and investment issues. And the third sense in which I think we are living in an age of rising inequality. Remember, the first sense are these massive fundamental forces. The second sense is that we are in a world of globalized factor markets, or with high factor mobility, which was not the case 50 years ago. 50 years ago, 60 years ago, a country could in fact have a progressive tax system, have a corporate tax system, and not fear the outflow of capital, because actually there were capital controls. We don't have that anymore. So those things need to be replaced now by international agreements. And for that, you need institutions which are up to the mark. And in my writings, I've argued that many global institutions, like the World Bank, are showing their age and are no longer fit for purpose. I won't talk about this in great detail because that would be subject for a whole completely different talk. Let me just give you one small illustration of this. When we have these cross-border issues, whether they're in the taxation realm, whether they're in the climate change realm, whether they're in sort of a financial contagion realm, whatever it is, the point is we're dealing with global public goods or global public bads. Okay? You need instruments which are not country specific. Okay? And the point is that the agencies, the post-war World War development agencies, like the World Bank, like the Asian Development Bank, like the Latin American and like the Inter-American Development Bank, like the African Development Bank, and so on. All of these agencies, their key instrument is the sovereign loan instrument. It's loan to a particular country. And the reason why, and that's been hugely successful, okay? It can be argued that the first 25, 30 years after the Second World War, the golden age of capitalism and so on, Japan's bullet train, all those sorts of things were helped by this instrument. But you see, a sovereign loan instrument is a loan given to a particular country for a particular purpose, and then repaid by that country once that purpose has been, once a loan is due. But the moment you have cross-border issues, it's very difficult to actually allocate and assign costs to one country, benefits to that country, and so on. So actually what you need is an expansion of grant instruments, not loan instruments. And the World Bank's core instrument, or any of these multilateral development banks' core instrument, as the name indicates, is actually a sovereign loan instrument. So that's just one sense in which the institutions of today are not fit for purpose for the sorts of issues. There are many other things which I've written about, the governance of these institutions and so on and so forth, and we can discuss those as well. The point is that the weakness of global institutions in addressing these cross-border questions, in my view, is a third sense in which we are living in an age of rising inequality. The inability to cope with those fundamental forces is in my view, the third reason. So let me conclude. I'm coming to the end of my presentation. Are we living in an age of rising inequality? My answer is no, but yes. And it's clearly no, because inequality is not rising everywhere. Just empirically, it is not rising everywhere or almost everywhere. There are significant parts of the world where it is not rising. So one cannot claim that. Just empirically, factually, that's the case. We then have to understand why it is that it's rising in some parts and falling in other parts. But also my answer is yes, in the following three senses. First, the forces of technical change, and there are other forces also that we might talk about. The forces of technical change are aligned to raise inequality on a policy as usual scenario. Two, but at the same time, cross-border flows of capital and labor in the globalized world economy put major constraints on governments in addressing these forces. And that was not true 50 years ago, 60 years ago, where we did not have these global constraints on domestic policy. And the third, in the presence of these mobilities, these cross-border things, we actually need institutions which can manage those, like implement minimum tax agreements, like and other things which I haven't talked about here, like climate change agreements and so on. And unfortunately, global institutions currently are not up to the mark. They're still the institutions of 1945. They're not the institutions of 75 years later. So that's my conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ravi. Let's open it up to questions. The chat box is also open. I'll watch that. But who has the first question?
I think Ed, is it Ed?
I can go. Thank you very much, Professor Kanbur, for excellent seminar. I have a question. Maybe I'll propose this hypothesis on a fourth ES on inequality, and it relates to kind of subjective social status, that the felt inequality in the world, which I hypothesize has increased tremendously over the last 30 years due to the rise of social media. Everybody now, for the first time ever, knows how the other half of the world is living, which when I was young, you did not have any such knowledge. And I think this has implications on political economy, because what is rising, all this political unrest, partly pertains to, this relative wealth and, kind of subjective social status. I wondered if you could comment on that, the hard numbers compared to what people feel like on a day-to-day basis.
I think that's a very good question, Ed, and a very good point. And of course, I have to agree with you that our conventional economic, you said hard, but actually I think of those things are quite soft. The stuff we do is actually relatively soft. Once you know how the data are generated, once you've been into the sausage factory and you know how the sausages are made, and it's you and I, we've actually been in the field and collected this data, and so we know that they're actually quite soft, the numbers. But anyway, I know what you mean. I think that in fact there are these, and I in some sense I hinted at a counter example, which is that the so-called hard numbers that we see in the Middle East, okay, are actually showing not an increase in inequality. Okay, in Egypt, in Tunisia, all these places which are. And the narrative was it's something to do with inequality which is rising, okay? which is clearly it's not the inequality that we're measuring. Okay, but then what is it? And I think there's a hint in what you're saying that it's not that, but it's some sense of lack of opportunity, of that connectedness is what's important. in the Arabic and Middle East thing, it's wasta is what's important, who you know to get the job, etc. Because in fact, one of the reasons why inequality is not showing this is because transfers are very big in the in Middle Eastern countries. And in the household service, as we know, it's you calculate these things, including transfers. Okay? Including transfers, actually inequality. But so market inequality is increased, but market inequality plus transfers is keeping inequality in check. And in different societies, that can have a different connotation. Okay? And the argument that I read, and there are books written about this, is that, for example, in Middle Eastern context, okay, yeah, the fact that I get food subsidies is fine, but actually what I want is a job in the car factory or in the ministry and so on, and I can't get it because so-and-so had a contact and they got the thing. And so on. So anyway, so I'm fully accepting your point, and actually there's a lot of work going on this thing just now. And it's actually also just from a purely technical point of view, if I may just mention briefly, is how does one take this notion of relative deprivation, so to speak, okay, that it's relative to something. You then have to say relative to what? But anyway, how can one then relate that to conventional measures of inequality? So there's also a lot of work going on that, and I and other people have contributed a little bit to that.
Thank you.
Professor Kanbur, a question. As a former insider in the World Bank, how do you see the way forward on making the sorts of changes toward stronger international institutions that are capable of moving beyond the sovereign loan to grant programs and other options?
So I think we have big issues. We have big problems. So let me just talk a little bit again about one of the governance issues that arises in these sorts of agencies, particularly the World Bank. Okay. So last year was the 75th anniversary. Was actually 1944 they were founded. So 2019 was the 75th anniversary, and many of us wrote papers around that time. And the governance side of it is that written into the charters in 1944 was that the veto power was with essentially any country with more than 25% of the vote had veto power, or I think 35%. The US had 36% at the founding, and gradually, of course, it's all moved, but the veto threshold and the US vote share has kept just that bit of distance, so that the US always has veto share. And we're now in a situation where actually the World Bank's capital base has increased, but it shrunk relative to the world economy. Okay, as I like to say, the World Bank is becoming irrelevant at the rate of 7% per year. Which is the average growth rate of developing countries, because its capital base is remained constant. And many countries like India, like China, are saying we will contribute to the capital base, so that you can then use the multiplier effect to use these things to bigger effect. This is a slightly different question from the nature of the instrument, but you'll need the lending base in any event, okay, for this stuff. So the US is in the following position: it neither wants to contribute, because its own budget constraints, but it doesn't want anybody else to contribute either, because if it does, its vote share will be diluted and it will come down below the veto threshold. So here's a perfect catch-22 where we're stuck in 1944, okay, 1945. So for a start, until that is somehow resolved, until some break comes in that, we're going to be stuck in that context. And the thing is, in order to change the veto share, you need a veto-proof vote, and so the country which has the veto could veto the removal of the veto. Okay, so I'm just giving you that as an example of this thing. Now, one route that has happened is given the constraints on one institute, is that new institutions are being created. Okay, so we have the Asian Infrastructure Bank, we have this, we have that, etc. But I think these institutions have the same issues. Their core instrument is also the sovereign loan instrument. they also have the dominance of one institution, and so on and so on and so forth. So I'm relatively, at the moment anyway, I'm relatively pessimistic about this capacity to actually just increase, because you need the okay of all of these countries. So we had another question in the chat, is it? Yeah, so I sort of, this is from Johan Pelletier, yeah. And I suppose it's the same sort of issue, and it's a big question as to what is it that's going to bring a change about in these international institutions. I'm afraid I'm relatively pessimistic, minus some big crisis. Remember how these institutions were set up was at the end of the Second World War. Okay, so and frankly, we have thankfully, and partly because of these institutions, we have not had that sort of a crisis. But presumably, I suppose, again, I'm just sort of brainstorming here. I haven't sort of analyzed this thing myself. Is as the growth of China sort of becomes more and more important, and some need for accommodation arises. But you see, the way that has actually been handled is by China creating its own institutions. Just as Japan created its own, quote unquote, created its own institutions in the Asian Development Bank, as it sort of grew in prominence, China has created its own one as it's grown in prominence. I don't think that's the right way around it, but that is how the world is actually reacting to these things. So I think some sort of big crisis is what's going to call these governments together, and unfortunately.
Questions? I'll ask another one on the issue of cross-border floors for some corporate taxation, migration, or cross-border agreements related to migration, related to corporate taxes, related to other things that are currently limiting domestic policy efficacy. How much are you hearing the argument that countries are starting at a very different place in their development process, in that a uniform floor across all nation states is not fair to those who are starting at a lower level?
So I think that's a very, very interesting point. And this particular question was actually faced by the European Union some years ago under the umbrella of tax harmonization. You know, the moment you have free movement and so on and so forth of goods, etc., then you have to worry about tax rates being very different across countries. Okay? And the point is that the European Union was actually creating a common market. It was creating a situation where there was free movement. So they had to think about this question. And exactly this issue came up. So going in, you know, Ireland had very different tax rates to the et cetera. And the initial impetus was to have a uniform tax across all European Union countries. Okay, and it's clear that is not right. That won't fly politically, but actually even economically, it's not from a pure economic point of view. It doesn't make sense to bring things together in this way. Actually, since the issue is a race to the bottom, a common floor is the answer. Okay. And then there you can see, I mean, that is both from a rational economic point of view, the right thing to do, to prop up to put a floor under these things. If the competition thing is to push things down, you put a floor under it. It's also politically that, you know, you're then saying, okay, I don't care if you want high tax rates, that's perfectly fine with me. Okay, what I don't want is tax rates below this bottom floor. So I think that is much more easily doable, okay, relative to a complete harmonization, I think. But the key thing is that Europe had a political agreement across the different countries. Okay, so there were trade-offs. They're saying, you know, fine, I'll give up this. Ireland says I'll give up my whatever it is, but in return I will get something else in this thing. And there was this political impetus to have a unification across Europe, again, the legacy of the war and so on, which I think led to that. But now, of course, you see, 50 years into it, we've had Brexit and so on. So whatever the advantages of a minimum floor on these things, you can only have agreed on that if you had agreed on these other things. But if you disagree on those other things, then this becomes very, and I think that's going to be the difficult, for example, for the Biden administration to talk about a minimum corporate tax floor. There are also sort of technical issues, of course, about, you can always have offshores to offshores and so on. But I think much more the issue is a political issue of how you're going to bind these countries together.
Okay, last call for questions.
I think Sarah.
I'll jump in. Thanks for a really interesting talk. And I know that so many of these questions are so complex and go in so many different directions. So you did it. It was really helpful to have you kind of outline all those different pieces. I just wanted to know what you kind of thought about the role of population, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, and what role it'll play in shaping inequality across the continent. Just because right now I really see a big gradient in fertility transitions across class. And so I think when I look across a lot of places, I'm imagining that has the possibility to lead to sort of widening disparities. But I don't know. I just wanted to sort of see what you thought about that.
Yeah. So I haven't sort of thought about the demographics and the link with inequality within African countries, so to speak, within each of these. And you saw, as I said before, for the 20 or so countries that this report looked at, Kathleen Wiegel's report looked at, half of them one way, half of them went the other way. And I'm sure that's also linked to population type things. And but they couldn't find any systematic connection because there are so many things going on. But I think the population increase in Africa, again, drawing on some other work that I've done, has global implications. Okay, I think that's the thing where it has really. One interesting thing is that that the conventionally measured incidence of poverty in Africa has fallen over the last 30 years, leaving to one side, of course, the current situation. So okay, just the fraction of people below the poverty line has fallen, but the population growth is so high that actually the total numbers in poverty
nominal.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way, nominal is the wrong way word to use. That's the real thing. The real thing is the number of people who are poor has actually increased. And by the way, I think this is a general point which I say to my fellow economists all the time, that you really have to distinguish between the incidence of poverty and the total number of people in poverty. Okay, and I came across this in a very strong way in Ghana when I was going around saying, look, the poverty in Ghana has fallen, meaning by that the incidence of poverty has fallen. And people saying, no, you don't know what you're talking about. Actually, poverty has risen. It's not that one is right and the other is wrong. It's just a different way of looking at this thing. If I'm dealing with street children and I'm dealing with indigents in the street, and actually that demand has increased, then some guy in a suit comes along and says poverty has fallen. It would drive me crazy in this thing. So, and actually, this way in which we economists measure poverty, I think, goes back to one of Amartya Sen's axioms, where and it's called the population replication axiom. And it basically says, take two islands, on one of which there are 100 people, 50 of them are poor. The other island, there are 100 people, 50 of them are poor. Combine the two islands. Is the island is the combined island poverty greater, lesser than the constituent islands? And as an axiom, Sen said the poverty is the same in the constituent island. And that's what leads to the normalization by population thing. Okay. So first of all, it's just simply a question of, and many of us argued at the time that actually you should put absolute numbers of poor in the thing rather, and the World Bank started doing that in its reports and so on. But the second thing is it's this increase in numbers of the very poor, and of course because of the overall increased population, which is leading to migration pressures. Okay, which is leading to migration pressures, and I think that's something that we covered in this international panel on social progress as being one of the challenges that's coming to us. So So I don't have because I haven't analyzed it myself, I don't have an answer to how the demographic changes within African countries will affect measures of inequality and so on over a 20-30 year period. But I have thought about and written about this, the overall African demographic bulge, how that affects the way that we measure poverty, and also the migration pressures that are coming in Europe and other countries.
Interesting. Great. Thanks so much.
Okay, we're at the end of our time.